So how does a $250 million scheme, a program that was supposed to feed hungry children, just explode into a potential $9 billion scandal?
It's almost hard to wrap your head around, isn't it?
And in the process, reveal this, just a shocking lack of accountability deep inside Minnesota state government.
That is the absolute core of it, and that's what this deep dive is all about for you, the learner. We are going to dissect the official investigation reports, the political fallout,
Right.
and our mission, really, is to give you the clearest possible picture of how these systemic government failures allowed just a massive exploitation of taxpayer money to spiral completely out of control.
Okay, let's start there. Let's frame this with, say, a 90-second news hook, because the scale of this crisis it's
Yeah.
just staggering.
The scale is what sets it apart.
Yeah.
I mean, you have federal prosecutors estimating the total fraud, and this is across a bunch of different social service programs in Minnesota.
Not just the food program.
Not just the food program. They think it could top $9 billion.
$9 billion. That's a number that's so big it almost loses meaning.
It's one of the largest public fraud cases in U.S. history, and the political fallout, as you can imagine, has been immediate.
Absolutely. Just this week, this is January 5th, 2026, the Democratic Governor, Tim Walz, announced he's dropping his bid for re-election.
Citing the intense scrutiny over his administration's handling of this whole crisis.
And this thing went national so fast. I saw a viral video that was getting amplified by Vice President J.D. Vance, President Trump.
Exactly. And the Trump administration's response was almost immediate. They paused $185 million in federal child care funding that was headed for the state.
President Trump's language was really pointed. He called Minnesota a hub of fraudulent money laundering activity.
And he announced major changes to how states have to submit claims, demanding, physical evidence, things like receipts, even photos, before any money gets sent.
So this has been building for years. The first case, the one most people have heard of, is the $250 million Feeding Our Future case.
Right. And that alone has led to charges against 92 people. I think 62 have been convicted so far, and that number's still climbing.
But the FBI director said that case was, what was his quote?
Just the tip of a very large iceberg.
Chilling. It just underscores that this is a deep systemic failure.
It really is.
So let's start with that tip of the iceberg then. Section 1, Feeding Our Future and that just massive surge of COVID cash.
This was, a textbook exploitation of an emergency. The whole $250 million fraud, it really revolved around this one nonprofit called Feeding Our Future.
And on paper, they claimed they were using local restaurants, caterers, to distribute meals to kids through federal nutrition programs.
Right. But what they were actually distributing was fake documents.
So not meals.
Not meals. They were submitting fraudulent meal count sheets, fake invoices, and in return, they were just raking in millions in administrative fees and direct kickbacks.
And the numbers on the oversight failure, they're startling. The Minnesota Department of Education, let's call them MDE.
Yeah, MDE. They were the agency in charge of oversight. And in fiscal year 2021, they distributed 392% more money to these nonprofit nutrition sponsors than the year before.
382%. So a jump from what, around 70 million to
nearly $336 million in 1 year.
That is just explosive, unmanaged growth. And Feeding Our Future was the engine behind all of it.
They were. Payments to that single organization went up by, I think it was about 2,800% between 2020 and 2021.
2,800%.
It ballooned to over $140 million. So to put it another way, about 4 out of every $10 that went to all of these nonprofit sponsors
Went to this one group.
It's a gigantic, an unavoidable outlier in the data.
And you'd think that would set off some alarm bells.
Well, and here's where the state's regulatory system just started to buckle. The source material shows that MDE officials,
Huh?
they did try to slow things down. They tried to slow reimbursements early on. They sensed something was wrong.
But Feeding Our Future didn't just accept that, did they? They played a different card.
They immediately sued the state.
On what grounds?
They alleged racial discrimination was the real reason for the delay in payments.
Wow.
And according to the state's own auditor, the OLA, that threat, the threat of a lawsuit, and all the negative media attention, it directly affected MDE's decision-making.
So they chose to avoid a PR disaster over protecting hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars.
Exactly. When fear of a lawsuit replaces strict fiscal control, fraudsters see that. They see a green light.
And it's clear MDE failed spectacularly on the meal program. But as the investigator said, this iceberg goes much, much deeper. Which brings us to Section 2.
The deep iceberg. The fraud started spreading across multiple social services. Federal investigators told CBS News that child care fraud is, and I'm quoting, only vaguely a priority for them right now.
Vaguely a priority. Why?
Because their attention is focused on more than a dozen other high-risk programs. We're talking nutrition, housing, behavioral health. It points to a systemic rot.
So let's look at the second major area then, housing. There was a housing stabilization program.
Right. Designed to help seniors and people with disabilities find housing. The initial cost estimate was pretty modest, about $2.6 million a year.
And last year's spending was?
Over $100 million.
$100 million? How does that even happen?
It happened because the program was intentionally built with, and these are their words, low barriers to entry and very few record-keeping requirements.
So for you, the listener, low barriers just means low verification. The government asked for the bare minimum amount of proof, and they lost that bet catastrophically.
They lost it badly. We even saw what prosecutors started calling fraud tourism.
Fraud tourism.
Yeah. 5 people were charged with bilking this housing program. 2 of them were from Pennsylvania with no real connection to Minnesota. They just traveled there because they knew the program was an easy mark.
They saw the low barriers, the high reward, and professionals moved right in. It's a case study in how not to set up a government program.
And then there's the third program we need to cover. This one involves autism service fraud.
What happened there?
Here, a couple of defendants were charged with hiring completely unqualified behavioral technicians. Then they just submitted claims for services that either never happened
Or were done by people who shouldn't have been billing for them.
precisely. And the mechanism was really insidious. They paid kickbacks directly to parents, up to $1,500, just to enroll their kids in the scheme.
So they turned the families into participants in the fraud.
Which is why the first assistant U.S. attorney said this autism case is not an isolated scheme. In total, 14 Medicaid services in Minnesota are now under intense audit. They've all been deemed high risk.
That terrifying scope. It brings us right to Section 3, the accountability breakdown, the total failure of state oversight.
And the most damning evidence comes from the state's own watchdog, the Office of the Legislative Auditor, the OLA.
What did they find?
They concluded that the MDE's inadequate oversight didn't just miss the fraud. It actively created the opportunities for the fraud to happen.
And this wasn't just a pandemic problem. This goes back further.
Much further.
Yeah.
The OLA pointed out that MDE failed to act on warnings they knew about before 2020. They were criticized way back in 2017 after a court decision basically told them to strengthen their application review rules.
And they just didn't.
They chose to defer action. They left everything ambiguous.
So the foundation was already cracked.
It was. But what came next is just astonishing. MDE actually did an administrative review of Feeding Our Future back in 2018, before the explosion.
And what did that review find?
It found 22 serious issues. Things like inflated attendance records, unallowable expenses. I mean, huge red flags.
22 serious findings. So the next step should have been a follow-up, right?
A mandatory follow-up review to make sure they fix the problems.
Ew.
They never did it. They just delayed it until the pandemic was over, even though they could have done a virtual review. They had proof of major problems sitting in their files, and they chose to just ignore it.
That's not just dropping the ball. That's willful negligence.
And it gets worse. MDE officially found Feeding Our Future seriously deficient on 2 separate occasions. But in the end, they just deferred all those deficiencies. They never made sure any corrective actions were actually taken.
What about financial oversight? I remember hearing something about a required audit.
Another shocking failure.
Yeah.
MDE accepted an audit from the organization that was missing required elements, and this is critical, it was done by an unlicensed auditor.
An unlicensed auditor, that's just abandoning basic procedure.
It is. And here is where the failure becomes truly jaw-dropping. In March of 2021, MDE did a meal validation effort. They collected meal count documents from over 100 sites. They had the raw data in their hands, and they failed to investigate the most obvious irregularities. The federal indictments later pointed to identical, or nearly identical, meal count sheets. Same handwriting, same numbers, day after day.
And MDE saw this.
They had it in their files, and yet they approved all of those meal claims without any further investigation.
They literally had the smoking gun and still paid the claims. So when did they finally try to stop?
They did try to hit pause. They issued a stop pay order.
Right.
But they were immediately challenged in court.
Right.
And a district court judge called their stop pay order a real problem. That was enough. MDE, fearing the legal battle, just resumed the payments. They overrode their own financial concerns because they were scared of the courtroom.
So the state was more afraid of bad PR and lawsuits than stopping billions in fraud. That fear became the biggest enabler.
Which leads us to Section 4. This shows this wasn't just an MDE problem. This pattern of mismanagement was across different state departments. Just look at the audit of the Frontline Worker Pay Program.
What did the OLA find there?
They found the Department of Labor and Industry, the DLI, was approving payments to applicants who were clearly ineligible.
And to applications with obvious fraud indicators on them.
Right, with no investigation. The core problem here, and this is key for you to understand, is this reliance on self-attestation.
Meaning the government just took people at their word.
They basically bet that most people were honest. And the Department of Revenue, the DOR, was also supposed to verify income, but they failed to do it for all applicants.
So what was the OLA's big recommendation after all this?
It was pretty blunt. They said the legislature needs to seriously consider how much risk the state is willing to accept when it creates these huge, fast programs that rely on self-attestation. They're basically saying, stop building systems that invite this kind of fraud.
Okay, let's turn to the political fallout. This got national, and it got ugly.
It did. Governor Walz defended his administration. He said he'd spent years cracking down on fraudsters, and he accused his critics of politicizing the issue.
At the same time, as we mentioned, President Trump weighed in heavily. He blamed the Somali community in Minnesota and ended temporary deportation protections for Somali immigrants in the state.
And we should note that local officials, including Governor Walz, they denounced those comments as vile, racist lies. We're just reporting these statements impartially to show you the intense and very divisive environment around this whole crisis.
And the gravity is clear because Congress is now involved.
That's right. Republican Representative James Comer, he's the chair of the House Oversight Committee. He's opened a formal investigation. He's planning hearings. This is now a national issue.
So after all this, what does it all mean? What are the key takeaways for you, the listener?
I think first, these fraud schemes, potentially $9 billion. They exploited programs meant for the most vulnerable people, children, seniors, those with disabilities. The vulnerability was there because the state, through a combination of negligence and fear, just made it easy.
Second, the state's own internal reports confirm that agencies like the MDE failed to use the legal authority they already had. They ignored warning signs from 2017, they ignored 22 serious deficiencies in 2018, and they ignored identical documents in 2021. The bureaucracy was just stuck.
And finally, the core insight. The state's whole approach was inadequate, relying on this risky self-attestation. But maybe more fundamentally, the regulators chose to prioritize avoiding legal fights and bad press over stopping a massive financial hemorrhage.
So that brings us to our final thought. If systemic government failures, bureaucratic inertia, and the fear of political backlash allowed this level of unchecked fraud to flourish in Minnesota's massive federal programs, what specific steps should you demand your state take right now to verify that taxpayer money is actually reaching the people it's intended for?
And not just the fraudsters traveling from out of state to exploit weak systems. That's the question every citizen has to be asking right now.